John had been working as a garbage man for over 5 years. It was an easy job, one that didn't require much thought. Most days, he would simply drive his truck along the same streets, picking up trash, and moving on to the next house. There were a few regulars in the neighborhood, people who would wave or chat for a minute while he worked, but nothing that ever stood out. It was a typical morning when John started his shift, the sun still low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, as they often were at this time of day. As usual, he was making his way through the residential area, lifting and emptying the trash bins into his truck one by one. The houses were neat, well kept, with carefully trimmed lawns and flower beds lining the driveways. He had come to recognize the rhythm of the neighborhood, the sound of children's laughter echoing from open windows, the smell of fresh coffee wafting out from kitchens, and the usual hum of morning activity. As John approached one particular house, something caught his attention. He saw a woman standing near her driveway, her face buried in her hands as she wiped away her tears. John had seen her a few times before, but they had never spoken. She seemed like a quiet woman, probably in her mid-30s, who kept to herself. Today, however, something was different. Her shoulders shook as if she were quietly sobbing, and she wasn't moving to bring her trash can to the curb like the others. John stopped the truck, unsure of what to do. He was just the garbage man, a simple worker who didn't often get involved in the lives of the people he served. But today, something about the woman's distress made him hesitate. His instincts told him that something wasn't quite right. He waited for a moment, watching her from a distance. The woman, whose name he later learned was Sarah, was still standing there, her back to him as she stared at the trash bags she had already placed in front of her house. Her posture seemed tense, as if she was holding something back, trying to control her emotions. John couldn't tell what was going on, but the sense of unease grew in his chest. Then, as he was about to drive past, something caught his eye. Sarah moved toward one of the trash bags and lifted it as if she was preparing to throw it into the bin. As she did, a slight shift in the bag caused it to open for just a moment. John's eyes widened as he saw something inside. A large object, not like anything he had ever seen in a trash bag before. He couldn't quite make out what it was, but it seemed strange. It looked almost like a crushed piece of metal, but it was so misshapen that he couldn't make sense of it. It didn't belong in a normal trash bag. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that whatever it was important. His mind raced with questions. What was it? And why was she throwing it away? He watched Sarah closely, hoping to get a better look at the object, but she quickly moved away, heading back toward the house. Her hurried steps made it clear she didn't want to draw attention. John, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was no way this was just another piece of trash. Something in his gut told him that this was different. Something told him to pay attention. John couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The strange object in the trash bag had been on his mind ever since he noticed it. He was just a garbage man, but something told him that what he had seen was no ordinary piece of junk. His curiosity grew, and he found himself glancing back at Sarah's house as he continued his route. The usual sense of routine had faded, replaced by a gnawing feeling that he couldn't shake. As he made his way down the street, John tried to focus on the task at hand. He picked up the next trash can, emptied it into his truck, and moved on to the next house. But each time he passed Sarah's place, his eyes instinctively darted over toward her front yard. She wasn't outside anymore. He hadn't seen her go back inside, but the house seemed oddly still, as if it was hiding something. The more John thought about it, the more he felt uneasy. Why had Sarah been so quick to move away from the trash bag after she had lifted it? Why had she seemed so distressed? Everything about the situation felt off. It wasn't just her tears that bothered him. It was the way she had acted, as if she was trying to avoid being seen. The object in the trash was another mystery. John had only seen it for a brief moment, but it had left a lasting impression on him. He couldn't get the image of it out of his mind. Whatever it was, it had been crushed beyond recognition. The shape was bent and misshapen, but it was big enough to be something important. A part of him wondered if he had just imagined it, if maybe his mind had played tricks on him, and it was just a piece of scrap metal or something else that was perfectly ordinary. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. John had been on this route for years, and he had seen a lot of strange things: old furniture, broken appliances, and all sorts of discarded odds and ends. But he had never seen someone so clearly upset about what they were throwing away. He had never seen someone try to hide what they were getting rid of. It felt like she was throwing away something precious, and that unsettled him. His thoughts swirled as he continued working, but there was no ignoring the fact that something wasn't right. His instincts had kicked in, and they were telling him that this was more than just another ordinary day on the job. The object in the trash might have been just the beginning. The more he thought about it, the more he felt a need to know what was really going on. Maybe it was nothing, just an overreaction on his part. But part of him knew he couldn't let it go. Something about it was too important, too strange to ignore. John continued on his route, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah and the mysterious object. What was she trying to hide? What did she want to keep so secret? As much as he wanted to move on, the questions kept coming, and the answers seemed just out of reach. The sense of mystery surrounding Sarah's actions was growing stronger with every passing minute. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about what he had seen. He tried to ignore it at first, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. After all, he was just a garbage man, and it wasn't his job to get involved in other people's personal lives. But the more he thought about it, the more it nagged at him. The object in the trash, Sarah's distress, the way she had quickly disappeared back into her house, it all felt like a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. As he continued his route that day, John found himself distracted, unable to focus on the job at hand. His usual rhythm was interrupted by thoughts of Sarah. Who was she? What had caused her to be so upset? Why had she thrown that strange object away? And what did it all mean? John had always been a curious person, but this situation felt different. It wasn't just about asking questions for the sake of it. Something told him that this was important, something that needed to be figured out. But what could he do? He wasn't a detective, and he didn't have any special training. He was just a guy doing his job, picking up trash. Still, the more he thought about it, the more the situation seemed to weigh on him. He considered talking to Sarah, maybe asking her what was going on. But what if she didn't want to talk? What if it was something personal, something she didn't want anyone to know? John had seen enough in his years of working this job to know that people didn't always want help, even if they needed it. The idea of getting involved, of asking too many questions, made him uneasy. He didn't want to overstep any boundaries. But the mystery of it all kept him up at night. The object in the trash kept coming back to him. He tried to convince himself that it was probably nothing, that he had misunderstood, that he was making something out of nothing. But something deep inside him told him he wasn't wrong. He found himself questioning his instincts. Should he just let it go? Should he forget about it, as if nothing had happened? Or should he do something? The thought of doing nothing made him feel uneasy, like he was ignoring something important. But what was he supposed to do? He was just a garbage man after all. It wasn't his responsibility to solve people's problems. John couldn't help but think about the people he served every day. They were just regular folks like Sarah. They all had their own lives, their own struggles, things that no one else really understood. But what if Sarah was in trouble? What if she needed help, and he was the only one who had noticed? The idea that he might be the only one who had seen something that didn't quite add up made him feel like he had to do something. It was a tough decision. John didn't want to overreact, but he also didn't want to ignore a potential problem. He was torn between wanting to be respectful of Sarah's privacy and feeling like something needed to be done. There was just too much about the situation that didn't make sense. The uncertainty continued to gnaw at John as he made his way through the rest of his route that day. Despite his best efforts to concentrate on the task at hand, his mind kept drifting back to Sarah and what he had seen in the trash bag. It wasn't like him to let something like this linger on his mind, but this felt different. Something inside him told him that ignoring it wasn't an option. As John drove his garbage truck down the quiet streets, he wrestled with the idea of getting involved. He thought about the few times he had tried to help people in the past, offering a kind word, lending a hand when someone needed it, but nothing had ever felt as urgent as this. What if Sarah was going through something she couldn't handle on her own? What if she was hiding something important, something that could hurt her or someone else? The longer he thought about it, the more he realized that his gut was telling him to act. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a sense of responsibility. But what could he possibly do? He wasn't a trained investigator, just a regular guy with no real experience in dealing with the kind of situation he was imagining. The idea of calling the police crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. What if it was nothing? What if it turned out to be something totally harmless, and he had made a big deal out of nothing? Despite his hesitation, John found himself picking up his phone when he had a moment alone during his break. He had the police station's number saved in his phone, just in case, but he never thought he would need it. With a deep breath, he dialed the number and waited for someone to pick up. When the dispatcher answered, John hesitated for a second. He didn't want to sound paranoid or overdramatic, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that something was off. "Oh, hi," he said, his voice a little shaky. "This is John, the garbage man. I'm calling because I saw something this morning that I think might be important." The dispatcher's tone was calm as she listened to his story. John explained what he had seen. The object in the trash, Sarah's emotional state, how he felt like something wasn't quite right. He made sure to explain that he wasn't sure what he had seen, but that it had struck him as strange. "I don't know if it's anything," he said, "but it felt different. I just thought I should let you know." After a few moments of silence, the dispatcher reassured him that someone would check it out. John felt a weight lift off his shoulders, though he still felt uneasy. Was he overreacting? Would the police even take him seriously? But at least he had done something, even if it was just a small step. The rest of the day passed slowly. John couldn't stop thinking about what might happen next. He hoped the police would figure it out, that whatever Sarah had been hiding would be dealt with in the right way. But part of him couldn't help but worry. Had he done the right thing? Would Sarah be angry at him for getting involved? John knew it wasn't easy to ask for help, and he wasn't sure how she would react to someone calling attention to her situation. As the day wore on, the unease lingered. John had done what he could, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he realized. What was really going on behind closed doors? And would he ever find out? The next morning, John woke up with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He had done his part. He had made the call to the police, explaining what he had seen and his concerns about Sarah. He had done what felt right. But now, he was left wondering what would happen next. Would the authorities take him seriously? Would Sarah be upset that he had gotten involved? He had so many questions, and the waiting was almost unbearable. As John made his way to work that morning, he tried to keep his mind focused on the task ahead. It wasn't easy, though. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah and the strange situation he had witnessed the day before. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the sense of urgency he had felt wasn't just a fleeting feeling. There was something important about what he had seen. The object in the trash, Sarah's distress. It all felt connected to something bigger, something he couldn't yet understand. His route was just as quiet as usual, but today everything felt different. John was hyper-aware of his surroundings, noticing every detail more than he usually would. His thoughts kept circling back to Sarah, and he couldn't help but wonder what was happening behind closed doors. Had the police already investigated? Had they found something? Or had he overreacted And it was all just a misunderstanding. Around mid-morning, as John was picking up trash at a house a few streets over, he noticed a car pull up near Sarah's house. His heart skipped a beat. It was an unmarked police car, and it slowly parked in front of her driveway. John stopped what he was doing, his hands frozen on the handle of the trash can. He could see two officers getting out of the car and walking towards Sarah's front door. His stomach twisted with nerves. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, and it was both reassuring and terrifying. He couldn't help himself. He had to know what was going on. With a quick glance over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, John hurried over to the nearest corner, trying to stay out of sight, but close enough to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The officers rang the doorbell, and John watched as Sarah opened the door. She looked as calm as ever, though there was a slight tremble in her hands. It wasn't the same frantic energy she had shown the day before, but there was still something off about the way she held herself. The officers spoke to Sarah for a few moments, but from where John was standing, he couldn't hear what they were saying. It was too far away, and the sound of the wind rustling the leaves made it hard to catch their words. Sarah's face was hard to read, but John could see the way she looked down at the ground, then back at the officers. After a brief exchange, the officers followed her inside. John stood there for a few minutes, his heart racing. He had done his part, and now the rest was out of his hands. But the uncertainty still hung in the air. What had the officers found? Had they discovered something in the trash that was connected to Sarah? Or had it all been a misunderstanding? John's curiosity got the best of him, and he stayed hidden just a little longer, watching the house intently. He didn't know what he expected to happen next, but he hoped that whatever it was, it would bring clarity. As much as he wanted to know the outcome, part of him also felt a bit guilty for being so invested in someone else's personal life. But the thought of Sarah and whatever she was hiding wouldn't leave his mind. He had seen the object in the trash. He had seen the way she tried to hide it. It was hard to ignore the possibility that something bigger was at play. Soon enough, the officers emerged from the house. Sarah was standing at the door, her face pale, but she didn't look as distressed as before. She gave a quick nod to the officers as they got back into their car. They drove away without saying much to her, and she closed the door behind them. John stood there, still hidden in the shadows, unsure of what to do next. He was waiting for something, but he wasn't sure what. Would Sarah come outside and explain what had just happened? Would the police contact him to let him know they had figured things out? He had so many questions, but now, all he could do was wait. The day passed slowly for John after the police had visited Sarah's house. He couldn't shake the image of the officers leaving her home, her face pale, the door closing behind them. Something had clearly happened, but what? Did the officers find something? Did Sarah confess to whatever it was she had been hiding? John's mind raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. The uncertainty was overwhelming. He had finished his route for the day, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. The usual mundane tasks of collecting trash felt insignificant compared to the storm of curiosity swirling in his mind. He knew he couldn't just let it go. He had seen something that didn't add up, and now the police were involved. That couldn't be a coincidence. Something important had happened, and Sarah's actions seemed to be a key part of it. John couldn't help himself. He had already made the call to the authorities, and now he felt like he needed to know more. Maybe he was overthinking things, but he didn't want to be left wondering forever. As he drove home that evening, his mind kept replaying the scene he had witnessed, and the nagging feeling of wanting answers grew stronger. When he got home, John had a decision to make. He could try to forget about it, move on with his life, and let the authorities handle it. Or he could take a step further and try to figure out what was really going on. He knew it wasn't his job to get involved, but his instincts told him that something bigger was at play. He sat down at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, trying to decide what to do next. Then something inside him clicked. What if he just asked Sarah? What if he went over to her house, Not as a garbage man, but as someone who genuinely wanted to know if she was okay. He wasn't a detective, but he knew that sometimes all it took was showing a little kindness. People needed someone to listen. Maybe Sarah just needed someone to talk to. She had been so upset when he had seen her, and she had clearly been hiding something. Perhaps she was struggling with something personal, something too difficult to face alone. The thought made John nervous. What if she didn't want to talk? What if she was offended by his offered help? He didn't want to invade her privacy, but at the same time, he didn't want to let her carry whatever burden she was facing all by herself. He had already made the call to the authorities. He had already crossed that line. Now perhaps it was time to take one more step and see if he could help in a more direct way. Taking a deep breath, John decided to go for it. He changed into a clean shirt, ran his fingers through his hair, and stepped outside. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or how Sarah would react, but he knew that he couldn't sit back and do nothing. As he approached her house, his heart began to race. He had no idea what he would find when he knocked on her door. Would she be angry with him for getting involved? Would she welcome the chance to talk? Or would she close the door in his face and tell him to mind his own business? When he finally reached her front door, John hesitated for a moment. He raised his hand to knock, then paused. It wasn't too late to turn back. He could go home, forget about everything, and let the police handle it. But the thought of letting Sarah face whatever was going on by herself didn't sit well with him. With a deep breath, he knocked gently on the door. John stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he gotten himself into? John stood at Sarah's doorstep, his hand still resting on the doorframe after knocking. The quiet that surrounded him felt thick, almost suffocating. His heart was pounding, a rhythm of anxiety that he couldn't control. He wasn't sure what he was expecting when he knocked. Maybe Sarah would answer with a smile. Maybe she'd slam the door in his face. But he knew that standing there without doing anything wasn't an option anymore. He had to find out what was going on. He stood there for what felt like forever, his mind racing with possibilities. What was he even going to say? He wasn't trained to handle delicate situations like this. He wasn't a therapist or a police officer. He was just a garbage man who had seen something strange and couldn't shake it. But that feeling of responsibility, the one that had been bothering him since he saw Sarah's distress, was stronger than ever. The door finally creaked open, and Sarah stood in front of him, looking somewhat surprised to see him. Her eyes were still slightly red, but she had a calm, composed expression on her face. There was no sign of the frantic woman he had seen the day before, but there was something about her demeanor that still felt guarded. "Hi," John said, his voice sounding more uncertain than he intended. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I saw you yesterday, and you seemed upset. I didn't mean to intrude, but I don't know. I felt like I should check on you." Sarah's expression softened for a moment, and she glanced down at the ground, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. She seemed to consider his words carefully before looking up at him again. There was a quiet vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of something unspoken that made John's heart ache. She opened the door a little wider, inviting him in, but her movements were slow, as though she wasn't entirely sure whether she should let him inside. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, her voice sounding a bit hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken much since yesterday. "I didn't expect anyone to check on me. It's just been a rough time." John stepped inside, careful not to invade her space too much. The house was cozy, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. It was as though Sarah had tried to make everything look normal, but there were little signs that something wasn't right. The piles of unopened mail on the kitchen counter, the empty space in the living room where a piece of furniture used to be. These small details seemed to speak volumes about the emotional weight Sarah was carrying. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble by calling the police yesterday," John continued, his voice soft. I saw something, and it didn't feel right. I wasn't sure if you needed help or if something was going on." Sarah paused, And for a moment, John thought she might brush him off. But then she sighed deeply. "I know you were just trying to help. I appreciate it. It's just, well, I'm dealing with something I don't know how to explain. I wasn't sure if I could talk about it, especially with someone I don't really know." John nodded, trying to show that he understood, even though he wasn't sure he did. He wasn't here to press her for answers. He just wanted to make sure she wasn't alone in whatever she was going through. "It's okay if you don't want to talk about it," John said gently. "I just want you to know that I'm here if you need someone. You don't have to go through this by yourself." Sarah's eyes filled with gratitude, though they also held a touch of sadness. She bit her lip, as if trying to hold back more tears, but she managed a small smile. "I'll be okay. I think I just needed someone to care. Someone to see that I wasn't just some person hiding away. I wasn't sure if anyone would notice, or if I was just losing my mind." John could feel the weight of her words, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about the strange object in the trash, or the mysterious situation he had stumbled upon. It was about something deeper. Sarah was carrying a burden, and she hadn't known who to turn to for help. John stayed for a while longer, talking with Sarah, letting her open up at her own pace. She shared a little about the troubles she had been facing, the personal struggles that had led her to try to hide things away. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time in a while, Sarah didn't feel alone. When John left her house that afternoon, he felt a sense of relief. The mystery had unraveled a little, but more importantly, he had helped someone who needed it. He didn't have all the answers, but he had listened, and sometimes that was enough. The days that followed felt quieter for John, but there was a strange sense of peace that came with knowing he had made a difference, even if it was just a small one. Sarah hadn't reached out again, and that was okay. John knew that the weight of her struggles wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. She had opened up to him, though, and that was a step in the right direction. His routine continued, picking up the trash, driving down the same streets, seeing the same familiar faces. But now, when he passed Sarah's house, there was a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. He no longer saw her as just another neighbor. She was a person with her own battles, her own stories that he had barely scratched the surface of, and it made him more aware of the people around him. Everyone was going through something, even if it wasn't obvious. A week later, as John drove his truck down the street, he noticed Sarah standing by her mailbox. She looked up when she saw him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no panic, no sense of unease, just a quiet acknowledgement. She gave him a small smile, one that made John feel like he had done the right thing by stepping forward when he did. She didn't owe him anything, but it felt good to see that she was okay, even if only a little bit. He slowed down as he approached her driveway, giving her a friendly nod. Sarah waved back, her expression warmer than it had been the first time he saw her. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like a quiet sign of healing. Maybe she hadn't completely figured things out yet, but at least she wasn't trying to hide it anymore. That, John thought, was a good start. Later that day, after finishing his route, John couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just a short amount of time. He had gone from being a stranger to Sarah to someone who had, in a small way, helped her face the truth. It wasn't about grand gestures or solving her problems. It was about offering a bit of kindness, something as simple as a conversation, and a willingness to listen. It was a humbling reminder that sometimes the most important things we can do don't involve solving problems or fixing situations. Sometimes the best thing we can offer is just being there for someone when they need it most. It wasn't easy to approach someone, especially when you didn't know the full story. But John had learned that reaching out, even just a little, could make a bigger impact than he'd ever imagined. As the weeks went on, life returned to a sense of normalcy, but John felt a little different. He paid closer attention to the people around him, noticing the small things that might have once gone unnoticed. People weren't always as they appeared, and sometimes the struggles they carried were invisible. The experience with Sarah had taught him that everyone had their own battles, even if they kept them hidden. And maybe, just maybe, offering a little kindness could make all the difference. By the time the weather had turned warmer, John had seen Sarah a few more times. Each time, their exchanges were a little more relaxed, a little more comfortable. She was still cautious, still dealing with her challenges, but there was a quiet sense of progress. It was a long road ahead for her, but John knew that sometimes the hardest part was just getting started. And in that small moment of connection, he had helped her take that first step. John smiled as he drove away from Sarah's house, feeling a sense of satisfaction that wasn't tied to the usual routine of this job. He had done something important, even if it seemed simple at the time. He had made a difference, and that was enough for him.